want to set the expectation up front of when they will hear from you and what about. You want to be really thoughtful about what is the intent, the purpose that we're trying to do with this newsletter, and come into the creation process with that in mind. What I don't recommend on like a newsletter, if you're going to have one field, don't have it be, how did you hear about us? It's not inherently valuable to the customer. Direct saving emails. If you give the exact amount they will save, you will get substantially more activation than just saying save 20%. Detailed walkthroughs. Can I actually take this information and go do something?
Hi everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Growth Mentor Live. Today we are covering how to build a better B2B newsletter. I'm Michael McGuire, Head of Growth here at Growth Mentor, and today I am joined by Casey Hill, Senior Growth Manager at ActiveCampaign and B2B Newsletter Extraordinaire. Guys, you are definitely going to want to have your note-taking materials ready for this session because it is going to be packed with tips and tricks that you are probably going to want to put into action immediately. But if at any point you have questions, please feel free to go ahead and put those into the chat. We will have a short Q&A at the end of the session to wrap up any questions. And yes, there will be a recording available, so if you're unable to join us for the full session, we will be having our video editor work her magic on this, and the recording will be in your inbox next week. Alrighty, so that's all of our housekeeping wrapped up. Casey, it is awesome to have you here with us today. Great to have you on. I am super excited to see you break down this topic because I feel like it is one that so many people have trouble with.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm super excited to get into it. I think that in 2024, owned assets are more important than ever. Having that ownership over your data and not being beholden to the algorithms and these kind of outside forces, walled gardens, as they're sometimes called, I think has huge upside. And at the same time, I think a lot of newsletters today are kind of just checkbox marketing, where people are doing the thing, they're going through the motion they feel like they're supposed to do, but it's not really driving real impact. So I'm looking forward to unpacking it.
Okay. All right. Awesome. Well, with that, I will go ahead and jump off and let you run the show.
Awesome. Love it. Cool. Well, I think one of the most important places to start when it comes to newsletters is I think for us to think about the goal layer. And so before you even kind of get into anything else, any kind of tactical best practices, the first thing is, why are you building this newsletter? Who is it for? Are you trying to increase customer sentiment? Are you trying to work on activation? Are you trying to use it to generate pipeline? All of these different goals, I think, materially represent a different structure of newsletter. And the most important thing is to not have your newsletter just be an amalgamation of everything. If your newsletter is like some company news and it's some updates and it's some case studies and it's just there's no expectation to reality, that's where things break down. So I think that is the first foundational step, is we want to be really thoughtful about what is the intent, the purpose that we're trying to do with this newsletter, and come into the creation process with that in mind. And if you currently have a newsletter and it's kind of all over the place, we'll kind of get into this a little bit, but I think I would strongly recommend for you to specialize, break it down, and possibly even create a couple different newsletters that fit into these different boxes. So I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to kind of walk through a handful of examples here and take you guys through each of the different kind of stages I would walk through. So we were talking about goals. Once you've set the goal, or potentially in tandem with setting the goal, one of the things I think it's really important is for you to think thoughtfully about the style, right? And broadly speaking, there's kind of three major buckets. And so the first of these bucket is kind of a curator style. And this is actually fairly uncommon, but it does have a lot of upsides. So the idea with a curator style newsletter, and a good example is something like Morning Brew, which some of you might be familiar with, it's very popular, is you're basically curating information. The way that people consume info today is we often find people we trust or channels we trust and use them as a shorthand to get the most salient insights in a specific industry or space. So this is actually a really good opportunity to be a trusted source for something in your sub niche, and you don't have to do a ton of creative or unique writing. And so that's obviously an upside from a production standpoint. So that's definitely something that I think could be an easy starting point for some folks and can allow you to stay really consistent. I mean, Morning Brew is like, almost a daily send, right? And they can do that because they're drawing that information from other trusted spots. And so the next kind of natural question though is, okay, well, I have my niche. I'm maybe interested in a curator angle, but where do I find content? So there's a couple different spots you can go to. So one is the Google News tab. You can kind of toggle in and look there. There's also relevant subreddits. So this is a huge opportunity and it's actually been talked about by a lot of top people like Sam Parr and other email experts that leverage subreddits to get a good sense of what is kind of trending, what is top of mind. And you can even search by like top topics over a certain time duration to really kind of understand that calculus. Another one that's really interesting in kind of this new AI phase is there's a tool called Perplexity. And Perplexity is kind of like a chat GPT, except for it has one big difference, which is that it provides full attribution in sources. So this can be a slightly different approach than the first two, which are kind of like topical or trending topics. This can be if you want to search into a topic and find what is ranking, what is kind of the most popular stuff, you can use something like Perplexity to run a search, find out through those sources what the top content pieces are, and then help curate those towards some sort of thing you want to put together. So bucket number one, we're kind of saying, hey, we're going to take some information, we're going to put it together in a way that's valuable. Number two is we're going to focus on not only curating, but also commenting on it, right? So now your original analysis is going to be an important part of the equation. So one example is what I read this week by Chamath Palihapitiya. And basically what he does is he not only mentions specific things that caught his eye, but he also provides that personal analysis and his feelings. And so you're getting a sense of that voice, which can be really important in a newsletter through that kind of blend. So this is a great kind of secondary stage, a little bit more work, a little bit more requirements in terms of your unique inputs, but I think can still be really valuable. And so the goal, again, we started this call by talking about the goal. So what is the goal of kind of the curator commenter style? I think that there's a couple things. Number one is you're becoming a trusted source of information, right? And by becoming a trusted source of information, you obviously have that ability to curate and find content that has those topical tails to your product. Meaning, let's say I was to do this at ActiveCampaign, which is a marketing automation tool. And one of the things we wanted to promote was like omnichannel marketing. I could go find specific pieces of content that kind of fit into that narrative and use that in a way that's both helpful to my customers, but also provides that kind of indirect pull into the product without being promotional at all. The other benefit that you can have here is the ABM or relationship building side. When you're curating these pieces of content from these outside sources, you can let those people know, hey, just wanted to let you know, we just sent this out to 12,000 subscribers, loved your analysis or your opinion on XYZ. This is an awesome way to open the conversation in a value add way. So can be really excellent for any B2B brands that are looking to kind of open up some doors and aren't having success, with their standard cold outreach on LinkedIn. Now, the next model is probably the most common, and this is creator model. So this is where you're going to actually share some unique data, some firsthand experience, some unique analysis. So as an example, I actually just launched a newsletter called SaaS Steps with ActiveCampaign, where we do kind of these unique breakdowns at every single stage of growth for a SaaS company. And that would be a perfect example of creator, because we're going in, we're doing the interviews, we're kind of pulling out unique data and insights that people can't find anywhere else, and we're bringing it in. I think what's really important here is the can't find anywhere else. So there's so much content that exists out there right now. If you are going to make a successful B2B newsletter in that creator style, you really need to be thinking about what is unique, proprietary, interesting that you're giving people access to that they're not finding in another spot. So here, I think this is more about the brand awareness, the topical authority. So if you look at a lot like Growth Unhinged or Scaling SaaS or a lot of my favorite B2B newsletters kind of in this space, what you'll find is that they're not like directly shilling any products. Instead, they're building authority in a topical area. So SaaS Steps, which is run by SaaStr, a SaaS event company, wants to build authority that we are a top voice in SaaS growth, right? So they're not plugging their, go to SaaStr every single newsletter episode. Instead, they're just focusing on the topical authority side and building their subscribers. right? So that was the first thing that I wanted to walk through with folks, is just to give a sense of these are three archetypes: the curator, the commenter, and the creator style. And each of those speak to slightly different goal layers. And connected to that macro issue of like, what is my core intent? What is my core KPI? Is this customer focused? Is this prospect focused? Is this lead focused? Okay. So with that in mind, I now want to kind of start, once we've set this goal, with the beginning of the journey. And the beginning of the journey is actually not your first send, even. It's not your episode 1. It actually starts with that opt-in experience and the actual welcome email. So I'm going to kind of go and I'm going to break down that piece, and we're going to walk through some specific examples to kind of take you guys through that. So the first thing is, you want to set the expectation up front of when they will hear from you and what about. And this has been one of my soapboxes, something that I talk about so frequently because it's so important, and yet amazingly, a huge portion of folks still don't do this. And so what does this mean? Very specifically, set the expectation of when they will hear from you. This means that you tell people, I am going to message you on Friday at 8 a.m. PST, and what about, and it's going to be a case study of how a brand grew from 0 to 1 million ARR. Very, very specific on the expectation of when they're going to hear from you and what about. And if people are like, well, but I don't know if I'm going to be able to have enough content to be able to feed in, what if my schedule's irregular? You need to wait until you have at least 3 episodes in the pipes so that you can stick to that consistent schedule. Because what happens is, when you set that expectation, I've been doing this for 12 years in the email world, there is a dramatic difference in your open and engagement rates when that expectation to reality is crystal clear. And if you don't have that, if email just kind of comes whenever and it's covering a huge gamut of topics, you are going to lose a ton of engagement, and also potentially have deliverability problems and all these other pieces from missing that. So here's an example from the reader where you go, you can opt in. It's saying it's a weekly newsletter. It's coming on Saturday. It's going to be about actionable writing and marketing advice. And they even give you a sense of each episode in 5 minutes or less. All about this expectation to reality crafting and trying to just get crystal clear here. Next is, and this is honestly, if you guys want a masterclass on what your welcome email should look like, I want you to go to Kyle Poyer's B2B newsletter, Growth Unhinged, because in my opinion, it is the best welcome email experience that I have seen. And there's so much that we can learn from it. So at a high level, what are those things that we can learn from it? So the first is, in that welcome email, it reiterates the exact expectation. Every Wednesday at 6:50 a.m. Eastern time, I will send you an email with an original in-depth take on how to grow faster, and it gives some examples. Awesome. A clear expectation of when and what. Now, that's the opening. The second piece is equally important, which is, here are 5 of the most popular editions to get you started. Now, look, if you're just kicking this off and you don't have past editions or past content, grab your top hits from the blog. Grab your top historical content that has performed well on social. Give them some ability to engage immediately. This is so critical, and I want to reiterate this. In that very first experience where someone opts in, you need to give them the ability to engage with something right away. What you never want to happen is, we send an email on Fridays and someone opts in on a Saturday, and now they have to wait and get nothing for an entire week from you. You want, someone has an intent signal when they're going to opt in. That's why they've opted in. And you want to always give them the ability to create that engagement. So that's the second key part of this. We set the expectation, we give them the ability to drive more engagement, and then it's cut off in this screenshot right here. But at the bottom, there's a third piece that's also critically important, and that is, he asks specific questions to get a reply. So the way that algorithms work when they're deciding who to put in promotions, who to put in spam, who to put in your primary folder, is heavily influenced by that reply rate. When people just write to their colleagues or they write to their peers, they have an 80+% reply rate, right? Your mom, your dad sends you an email, right? You reply to it. But bulk email has an extremely low reply rate. So it's one of the easiest ways that an inbox can decide, oh, this is just promotional, throw you in promotional folder. If you're driving a high reply rate, especially off those first interactions, you're substantially more likely to land in the primary folder. And anyone who tells you, oh, well, if you're sending marketing emails, it's, you're always going to land in promotions. That is a lie. I have been in this space for a long time. You are not destined to only be in the promotions folder. It is quite common, especially as you get a larger and larger newsletter, to fall into that promotion folder, but it is not inevitable. And if you have very good list hygiene, if you're scrubbing out people who aren't engaged, and you're purposely pushing for replies, you have the ability to not fall into that trap. So definitely opt into Growth Unhinged. Check out those 3 segments. Super, super important as an initial experience part. So you had your opt-in, you set the expectation, now you take them here, you go through those 3 blocks. The next thing that I think is also important to note is there's a number of cases where it makes sense to give people multiple choices for what they're really interested in. And I want to be careful here because if someone's just starting a newsletter, it's often, I'm not saying you need to start 4 newsletters at once. That sounds, kind of complicated and dense. But instead, if you're already running a newsletter, so I want to give you an example. I worked with John Hopkins a while back, a couple years ago, and they had one huge newsletter. There was an amalgamation of everything. It was like, things about the doctors at the hospital and all these specific, like you had a women's health topic corner, and they had one around Parkinson's and Alzheimer's and all these different topics. And the problem, of course, was that some people were interested in some parts of that, but because there was a dozen different topical areas, they had this huge, very unengaged list. So what did we do? What we did is, on the opt-in experience, we simply broke it into a whole bunch of different sections. One's about health, one's about, their clinical connection section, Parkinson's, women's health, and we created a dozen different newsletters. So we sent an email out to the entire list, and we basically let them know this. We said, hey, look, we're making this switch over. We want to send you the content that you're actually interested in. So here's how we've broken stuff down, and please update, click this link, update. We had a preference center so they could just click what newsletters or what topics they wanted to stay a part of and which they didn't. And it had so many positive benefits. Our open rates went through the roof. What was an unexpected but also amazing benefit is we also drove way more opens because the majority of people that stayed opted in chose to opt in to 2, 3, sometimes 4 or 5 different newsletters. So before we were only getting 1 open, now we're getting 5 opens. So that was a big difference and really powerful. So again, this is not for everyone. If you're just starting out, then you maybe can do this correctly on the offset. But for brands that are already sending a big email that's an amalgamation of a lot of things, or you're like, man, I work on I'm a marketplace side brand, and I have both sides of the equation, the vendors and the buyers, and it might be really powerful to just have a newsletter path that spoke to each of them. Awesome. Create an opt-in path, one for each of those, and you'll get way better engagement by keeping it highly topical and relevant to that group. Next thing is, let's talk about personalization. So if you guys go to opt in for Morning Brew, you'll find that they have like 12 questions or something crazy. I mean, they really dig into your job title and what your focuses are and all these different things. Now, for the majority of folks listening to this, you are not Morning Brew. You don't have 1 million plus subscribers. And so it probably doesn't make sense for you to have 12 questions that you ask. But oftentimes it can make sense to have 1 or 2 critical questions that really help you serve up better experiences. So what I don't recommend on like a newsletter, if you're going to have 1 field, don't have it be, how did you hear about us? That's just focused on you. That's for your information, your attribution. It's not inherently valuable to the customer. But if you ask about their industry or their role or their company size, and you can meaningfully segment or personalize their experience based on that, like I'm going to send you a different case study, or I'm going to send you a different breakdown based on that, then that is valuable. And sometimes people ask me, well, okay, Casey, but what question should I ask? It all comes down to what is topically relevant to that person. So for example, if you were like, should I ask for company size or should I ask for industry? It's like, well, what is a 10,000 person e-commerce business more similar to a 10,000 person B2B SaaS business, right? In which case, if those are more similar, like the 10,000 person company versus a 10 person e-commerce business, then maybe it's actually company size that's the right question to ask. But if instead you're like, no, the challenges that an e-commerce business has is very vertically specific, irrespective of size to a large degree, then that's the right question to ask. So be thoughtful there, but don't be scared of asking a single clarifying question to gather more information up front. I would say that less than 10% of newsletters do this, but you absolutely can if you want. And the other option, as you'll see here, is to try to get a little bit of the best of both worlds. You can do progressive profiling. What this means is you capture the email up front, you hit that next button, you've already captured them. All you needed was the email. So you get that same exact experience as someone who just clicks opt in, but now you ask the follow-up questions, and for people that choose to, they can provide that additional information and context that allows you to better curate experiences. So progressive profiling might be a way for you to kind of get both. The next thing is, I just want to really emphasize the importance of getting deep in the data. I think that Scaling SaaS by SaaStr and Growth Unhinged by Kyle Poirier are two phenomenal examples of brands that do this really well. And I was actually chatting with Kyle recently, and he said something that kind of hung with me, which is he said, look, the surface layer, quick content, I know everyone wants like quick, concise, it's got to be skimmable, etc. That's nice, but in some ways, it's very hard to get to a meaningful level of depth. And so it's actually interesting to see that specifically for B2B newsletters, a lot of the highest performing, most subscribers, most engaged, most action driving newsletters tend to get very deep in the data. So I would encourage folks to not be scared of having a longer newsletter. You still want to be smart with creating sections and breakdowns and make it easy for folks to digest. But getting into the depth and having something that's more long form is not bad. And again, one of the things that I think is really powerful about what Jason and the team does with Scaling SaaS is they have this kind of set format, expectation to reality. Again, 5 interesting learnings from a company at blank ARR. And they're always sending this thing out, and they're going to break down and they're going to give you, but it piques that interest of just, what are those interesting learnings? And as we all know, oftentimes it's like, okay, I know that, okay, not really relevant, but maybe it's tip number 3 that really draws people in. And the fact that there's a finite number of specific takeaways, someone dives in wanting to learn or to understand that thing. Finally, Mutiny runs a company newsletter that I think does one thing really smart that I like. And so I like to point it out for folks. And it is, they have it in this email, right? So at the very top, they say, we're going to talk about these things. So we kind of talked about how you typically don't want to have an amalgamation of a bunch of different things, but sometimes there will be some different sections, right? Like maybe you do firsthand analysis, but you also have some industry updates. And if you're going to do something like that, then giving someone a clear sense right when they hit the email within 5 seconds, can I just get a sense of what are we actually going to talk about? And so I know whether I care enough to jump around and digest and dig into this more, right? So I think that is an important kind of thing that you can do. Add in a block, have that title section. I think that's smart. And I think that's something that more brands should kind of leverage as a way to make your emails have a better overall engagement pattern. So that's another recommendation that I would have. So I'm going to pause once again. And again, so we're kind of like moving through these stages. We've set a goal up. We've looked at some different styles of like, okay, what is the actual core structure of these newsletters? And how can I get information for those different structures? And then we kind of move into this initial experience, the opt-in experience, the welcome email, and how can I kind of set expectations throughout that? One other small detail that I'll mention is that I do think that personalization is so important as part of, and when I say personalization, it's not just the personalization of like merge fields, the human side of your newsletter, like getting an actual human voice to come across. And there's a number of different ways. One is just like the writer not talking like AI generated content, especially if you're digging into data. Sometimes it can be easier just to like dump all of the data in. But having that unique lens and voice is what people trust and come back to. So I do think that's super important. And a lot of the B2B newsletters are good at that, of building that, like, oh, this is coming from. But another way that you can clearly signal that is you do your name at brand. So this is a question that people have asked me for a long time. And it's like, okay, for my newsletter, should it just come from Growth Mentor? Should it come from the name of the person writing it? Should it come from Foti? Or should it come from Foti at Growth Mentor? Right? Those are your three options. What I'm seeing more and more, and Exit 5, which is a B2B community, just did an awesome profiling on this, is more and more the top brands are doing that third option, which is name at company. You get the best of both worlds. They know the human behind it, but you're also bringing that brand in. So I think that's a really good best practice if you're trying to decide what to go for and kind of your approach there. And then in terms of your email, having named email. So if I was to send a newsletter, my newsletter comes from chill@activecampaign.com. My name is Casey Hill, so I'm always chill at wherever I work. So it's chill@activecampaign. That named email is also a best practice. What you don't want to do is send from catch-all addresses. Team at, admin at, sales at, support at. Those are a fast track to get into spam folders. And we could have a whole other section on kind of deliverability and kind of best practices there and how to think about that. If people have quick high-level questions at the end, I'm happy to kind of touch on those. But for the time being, I'm going to skim over the deliverability stuff and just make that notation that having a personal email where the stuff is coming from is important. The other thing I'll note is that, just as one more extension on this, is that deliverability looks at where the email links out to as the primary signal over the send from. So there's a couple things you want to avoid with like catch-all email addresses, as I noted. But in general, if you're like, hey, should I have my newsletter come from the founder if the founder is also sending these kind of update messages to people? And I don't know if that is that going to potentially impact that. What I would tell people is that a long time ago, the algorithms or people who wrote the algorithms are smart, and they realize it's very easy for a spammer to just rotate a million send from emails. You can just keep whipping up emails. That's very easy. And so what's much harder is to change the actual website or what you're linking to. So what that means is that is the primary signal. Like, what is the domain that you link out to in an actual email is the major deliverability or domain reputation determinant, not just the send from email itself, right? Because that's just easy to cycle through. So anyways, as a little bit of an aside, but just to kind of note for folks. The last kind of part of this that I'm going to unpack or get into a little bit, and then happy to open this up for questions, speak to any of your specific situations, is going to be focused in around the type of emails that tend to resonate and the type of emails that don't, right? And so one of the problems is we're so inundated with emails, and sometimes people kind of feel like, oh, it's just another email. Like, we get so many emails. They think that the problem is the volume of emails, but my contention is that it's not the volume of emails, it's the quality of the emails that you get. So I'm going to highlight emails that I think work really well, and then I'm going to highlight emails that I think are problematic. And not all of these are perfectly going to fit into the confines of a newsletter specifically, but I think it's important as part of this broader conversation of email marketing, and how do you get emails that resonate and actually drive value for a B2B organization versus ones that are just filler, checkbox marketing, or in the worst case, are actually actively hurting you. In the worst case, your B2B emailing is causing your core activation emails and your like core product emails to actually perform worse because you're impacting the deliverability and you're not driving meaningful pipeline or some other benefit. So what actually works? What actually drives revenue? So one is direct saving emails. So if you reach out to all the people that are subscribed to your SaaS product and you say, do you want to save, in this example, $1,030 a year on your specific account? Now here's the small nuance, but it's super important. I've run a lot of split testing on this specific topic for a decade. If you give the exact amount they will save, you will get substantially more activation than just saying save 20% a year on an annual account, which, by the way, that's kind of like the standard rate people save. It's kind of a generic message. It doesn't grab people in the same way as the exact amount that they can save. So if you can set that up and you can use that as a merge field within your system, the exact amount that they could save, that is really powerful, and that will drive substantially more adoption. And I recommend people to do this at months 2 and months 10 and like right around their renewal period. So like a couple weeks before they renew. Those are really good touch points to drive direct revenue and larger adoption from folks who are already there. The next kind of best practice when it comes to this is to design things that are focused on the problem, not the feature. So as an example, there's tons of emails that go out. Like I use this example, brand launches AI Kangaroo, the next generation of communication. I don't like really get any context. I'm like, okay, some AI feature, there's a million freaking AI features. Like, why do I care? That's the type of filler email that people often don't engage in. It's focused on the brand just wants to talk about a feature. We launched this cool feature, right? Instead of, we upgraded your chat, it's now 20% faster resolution with no extra cost. Now, that might be tied to the feature. That might be what AI Kangaroo does, right? But if I'm a customer and you tell me I'm going to get 20% faster ticket resolution and it doesn't cost me anything else, they just upgraded my service, dang, that's interesting. I am 100% going to click in and try to learn more. So that's an example of focusing on the problem and not focusing on the feature. The third is actionable data, not benchmarks. So our industry has, in B2B, has gotten kind of obsessed with generic benchmark data, right? So they'll be like, hey, the average open rate is X%, the average click-through rate is X%. And really, it doesn't have a ton of value. It's very general. It might tell you, oh, I'm lower than I should be in the industry, but you can't do anything with it. So like, oh, my open rate is 19% and the industry average in my niche is 24%. Okay, right? Take another application here where you message people based on that same benchmark data you gather, but now I tell people, look, when you run an abandoned cart email, you should send it 2 days after they abandon the cart versus 1 hour after they abandon the cart, because we analyzed 800,000 abandoned carts and the uptake is 6% better when it's 2 days after. Now, just for clarity, this is a randomly generated statistic, so I don't actually know whether 2 days or 1 hour is better for abandoned cart. But my point was just to illustrate that using it in that format is directly actionable, and I can go and change when my email sends based on this insight and hopefully get a better result. So actionable data, not benchmarks, I think is a really good best practice. The next point is around detailed walkthroughs, right? So we've kind of been talking about this in a number of different formats, but so much of newsletter content is just this 30,000 foot view, right? It's a lot of fluff and it's not getting into the actual meat and the core, like, can I actually take this information and go do something? So that's one of the areas where I think you can drive a ton of value. I used to run a newsletter called Growth Corner, and inside of Growth Corner, I would basically just break down how I got specific results. So for example, I drove over $1 million from podcast guesting, and I would tell people exactly how I did it. I'd be like, I go on Listen Notes, here's what my exact pitches look like, here's how I find the people, here's the filters that I use, here's how I manage and follow up with opportunities. Someone could take that one thing and then go replicate a result, right? That's so much more valuable than me being like, hey, when you reach out to podcasts, make sure that you're personal and make sure that you've watched an episode and blah, blah, blah. Someone can listen to that and it's like, okay. Like they kind of are like, here's some general pointers, but it's not specific, right? And so as much as possible with my content, I hope that I've left you with quite a bit of this on this session so far today, is to get really specific, right? Like we're getting into what does the exact format look like? What does the opt-in experience look like? What does that first email look like? All of these are things that you can hopefully go take and implement and get a very specific result with. The next one I have here is urgency-oriented emails. Now, these are really funny because for the longest time, I hated urgency-oriented emails. That would be like, I'll give you a direct discount if you buy by the end of the week or during this specific period. I just really didn't like them and I was like kind of turned off by it. But the longer and longer I've been in this space, I have learned that urgency-oriented emails do drive revenue. They do drive action. So despite the fact that I might have some personal biases against them, I've been behind the scenes long enough and I've looked at the data long enough to understand that urgency-oriented emails can be a really powerful part of your overall email arsenal in directly driving action that you need to push over the line in a certain time period. So I would recommend those. And potentially, this is also kind of a larger treatise or conversation on the fact that even if we personally have some emotions towards different styles, it is important to look at the data and what actually drives revenue, what actually drives pipeline and impact. So let's now kind of wrap this up with what doesn't work. So, what is bad practices for email? So, the first is we've kind of talked about this quite a bit today. It's the general emails with everything mashed together. Join our community and check out this feature and read this case study and come to our event. The problem with it, this is the one thing that I repeat. I'm like a parrot constantly repeating, no expectation to reality match, right? That is a core problem where people don't know what to expect. And so they're less interested because nobody wants to spend a bunch of time kind of sifting through, right? You don't want to make it a treasure map where you're trying to find the right thing and it's complex. Just very clear expectation to reality match. The next one, huge freaking problem in B2B, the relentless reminder. I could throw so many brands under the bus, and I'm not going to do that today. But there's so many brands where if you open a trial, it feels like you get 2 emails a day just bludgeoning you over the head with like, hey, what was this helpful? Here's another resource. Here's another resource. Here's another resource. You want to be really, really thoughtful here, right? It is not that you don't want to send additional context. You don't want to help people navigate. You don't want to maybe even in some situations just give someone a call. Try to connect with them depending on your product. But what you don't want to do is just have a rote reminder email. It's the same as like any outbound sequence. If you're going to do an outbound sequence, when has it ever been valuable for someone that doesn't have an established relationship for you just to keep like sending them an email being like, just checking in on that proposal I sent? Never, right? So just cut those out and make sure that each touch point is both meaningful and also is part of an understanding of someone's inbox and how important that space is, and you're not hitting them over the head a million times a week. If you need to send, when someone's say in a trial once a week, a really thoughtful email that adds additional value, adds additional context, awesome. Don't be doing it daily. And the third thing I put here is the arbitrary accomplishment, right? These brands that are like, hey, just so you know, we were featured as, I put Northwest Regional Top 10 Tech Brands in Inventory Management. But it's just to kind of poke a little bit of fun. And there's often these like random awards and they really don't matter to folks. I'm just being blunt. Like they don't drive a lot of trust. Maybe like the very biggest ones, right? But even those, to be candid, and you guys can comment and let me know if you feel differently, but even those 95% of the time people don't care, right? So 95% of the time people don't care about the big accomplishments, the Forbes, the like really high hitting stuff. So that tells you that the small random award that they've never even heard of, that's going to be like 99% of people don't care. So just something to be cognizant of. So again, I'm going to pause. I know we've covered a lot of grounds. I'll give a moment to just kind of pass this off for any questions, anything you guys have around email and around any of these kind of core parts of the journey that we unpack.
Casey, this has been awesome. I think I have actually got some questions both from some audience members that weren't able to join us and actually some questions myself after seeing some of these best practices in action. So I think the first one is that we have some folks that are kind of straddling the line. I think they've kind of fallen into that, they're over a couple of different categories. So in this case, the example, I'll just go ahead and read the question off. If I have a creator like newsletter, which is a blog post that includes a monthly newsletter of my post and other industry news, but then also have a weekly newsletter that is more curated news, is that confusing to my audience? And should those be operated as separate newsletters or sites, or does that risk diluting your efforts in your audience?
Yeah, so I mean, look, I think that having multiple newsletters and having those individual newsletters be more specialized is a good thing. So I would encourage folks actually, like it goes back to the John Hopkins example. And that was like testing this on a large scale, right? John
Mhm.
Hopkins was substantially more successful. And again, remember that byproduct that you would always take two opens if it's meaningful, if it's valuable content to them specifically. You'd always rather have more opens, more clicks, more
Right.
engagement. So my recommendation would be that for the vast majority of folks, it is better to have those multiple touch points. Now, of course,
Okay.
you want to be thoughtful of don't have repeat content. If you're saying like the same thing and it's like, hey, there's these slight differences, but you're doing updates that are the exact same updates in this email and then also in the other email that goes out 3 days later, that's something you probably don't want to do, right? So you want to be
Okay.
thoughtful around it, but definitely not bad to have multiple newsletters. And in fact, it can sometimes just drive more overall engagement and emotional connection to you as a brand.
Okay. And I think we've got another one from another audience member that wasn't able to attend about having multiple email people sending different emails. So let's say, your CTO is sending out the product updates, your community lead is sending out ones on the community. Is that risky at all? Are we getting into that deliverability debate? Because I know you had mentioned that basically there was this aspect of it's the domain that's being linked to, and the sender address doesn't matter so much. But I guess, again, from the UX perspective, would that be confusing to your audience potentially?
I don't think so. I mean, it comes back to a couple things. Number one is if you're following that practice that I said a lot of the top B2B newsletters are doing where you do name at brand, then name at brand already is bringing the brand into the question in both cases. So if
Okay.
you have two people from Growth Mentor that are sending out an email, but it's like name at Growth Mentor, name at Growth Mentor, they're getting
Mhm.
Growth Mentor in both cases, right? But what it's allowing you to do is it's allowing each of those individual people, the CTO and say the CEO, to build and to infuse their individual voice and bring loyalty around people in that specific cluster. Because those people might talk very different, they might converse different. And so it's an opportunity for them to bring their unique voice in. So I think it's good. I think having teams where you have those different voices, I think can be a great thing. And I don't think it's going to cause any deliverability challenges. Again, noting the importance being on your domain reputation tied to what you're linking out to is obviously going to be the same if it's the core website in those two examples. So as long as you're not using catch-all email addresses, these are personal email addresses, I think that's totally fine.
Okay. All right. Awesome. And kind of attached to this, I think, with that best practice of name at brand, I have seen some companies go with that. You mentioned the second one where it's just the name of the person. And I know as a user, I've had multiple times where I've been like, I never subscribed to this. And then I click open the email and I go, no, this is one of the regular ones that I read. How is there anything that you need to keep in mind when making these kind of handovers with switching up the names or things like that? Let's say, you've started off, we'll say we started off with just Growth Mentor sending the emails. Is there anything we need to keep in mind for, changing over to, Micah at Growth Mentor or Footy at Growth Mentor whenever it comes to making these switches?
Yeah, I think it comes down to it really comes down to the individual brand and how big is that personality. So let's take an example. Kyle Poirier at Growth Mentor runs one of the largest and most successful B2B newsletters. He does just Kyle Poirier. That's just his name, right? He can do that because people know Kyle. He's built that association. He has a large presence. If Jason Lemkin wants to send an email about something SaaS related, people know Jason Lemkin. He has 200,000 followers on social. He's a known voice in B2B. If you are not a known voice, if you don't have that association, then it's probably going to be much wiser for you to either go with the brand name or name at brand if you're kind of trying to build that. I would avoid that category too, because like you said, you're going to confuse people. So my major test on the pure name would be that I think it makes sense in applications where you have a big social presence, and especially for anyone who's in the creator realm, oftentimes creators are more known by their name than they are even by their brand. And so in those cases, it can actually make a ton of sense. They can actually perform much better with that second category than the first category if people know them by that. It's like, oh, Amy Porterfield, oh, Marie Forleo, oh, these people who like, I
Mhm.
really know who you are by your name. In those cases, I think that can make sense.
Okay. All right. Awesome. And I think I've got another one that has popped up for me personally because for the first time, I've actually gotten somebody that I signed up for their newsletter. And instead of getting the typical hit this button to confirm you're in, I got an email asking me to reply. And whenever you were talking about reply rates and that being a big deal for staying out of the promotions folder, basically I was going, oh, I bet that's what they were doing there. But does that risk, I suppose, making things more difficult and basically losing a lot of your audience in that case? Do we have a comparison between, does it work better for just hitting the button versus, actually having to make that effort of the reply rate? Because I remember when I sent the email, I actually attached a question. I said, by the way, what is your reply rate on this? Because I've got to know, because it was a marketing email. So is that something that's kind of like a riskier practice, or is that something that basically has worked well?
Yeah, so we're talking about kind of maybe potentially a couple different things. So one thing is single versus double opt-in, right? When you get a message that's like click to confirm you want to be part of this, that's double opt-in, right? So
Mhm.
should you have double opt-in? Personal preference. A lot of people in the email marketing space will say no. They'll say single opt-in, make it low barrier friction, just get people through the door. I personally like double opt-in. I
Okay.
personally like making it as hard as possible. When I say hard as possible, I just want people to have high intent. That's why it doesn't bother me to ask additional clarifying questions. It doesn't bother me to have
Okay.
double opt-in. I am all about, I want to get people that really want this content. They care enough that they're going to take those steps. When I ran Growth Corner, I had an average 75% open rate for over, 400,000 emails sent over the duration of when that newsletter ran, right? And that came off the back of just like all of those kind of practices, double opt-in, going through that. So that's one bucket. The second thing is a click is not the same as a reply in terms of signal. So
Mhm.
the idea of those being interchangeable, I don't think that's exactly how it works. The In our world today, so there's kind of a range of things I'll kind of unpack. The first thing I'll say is if you're thinking about what engagement metrics should I care about when it comes to email, I want people to remember this. I teach a course at Stanford and an email module. This is the first foundational layer I set down for folks. Opens are the least valuable, right? They're the
Mhm.
most manipulated. There's tons of auto opens, problems with that. Above that is clicks. But even clicks, there's a bunch of tools like Barracuda that basically auto open links to check for viruses. So even links are often manipulated. So opens are the worst. Better than opens or clicks, but clicks still have problems. Better than clicks are page views. So page views have a really interesting benefit is then when anything auto opens, it's an auto bounce because it's just checking to see if it has. It doesn't actually go to the source, right? It's a bot click, meaning that if you measure page views are a much better intent signal than clicks. So that's the third best. And the fourth best, the top, the king of the engagement metrics is replies. If you get an actual human reply where someone talks through something, that's the best. And so why that's kind of relevant is that replies are the gold standard for the inbox deciding where to place you. Because one of the battles we fight when it comes to email is how can we land in your inbox, your primary inbox, when so much content is hitting promotional alternative folders and not making it there. It is around that reply rate. So I do think reply rate is super important. I do strongly encourage people to push for replies. And what I would say is be intentional about the questions that you ask. So a bad question, in my opinion, is something that's super broad and open-ended. Like, and if you have any questions, please let us know. Right? Or I'd love to know like why you opted in for our newsletter. It's pretty dang broad, right? Versus when I had people that opted into my newsletter, what I used to ask folks is I would say, this newsletter focuses on three core things: reducing churn, customer acquisition, expansion, like expansion revenue. Which of those three buckets are you most focused on right now for your business? And because that was highly targeted, I had a ton of reply rate of people that were jumping in and answering that very specific question, hiking up those reply rates, but also opening a line of communication and creating that emotional connection. Because people so rarely reply to newsletters, I think one of the things that people are overlooking is when you get replies and you actually kick off a conversation, the emotional connection and loyalty to your specific newsletter is so much higher than if they don't do that. Because the average B2B person, you're subscribed to 20 newsletters. And maybe there's a couple that you normally open, but typically people like the idea of loyalty to a newsletter, like people typically aren't that loyal to newsletters. So if you want to create that, it often comes from that connection to the person. And if they feel like, hey, if I ask a question about this case study that just got published and I'll actually get an answer, and they've kind of built that rapport a little bit, that can be really valuable. And the final thing I'll say on that is someone voiced in my class, and I actually have heard this from a couple people, like, but what if I just like don't want to get so many replies? Like if I ask for questions, I'm going to get all of these replies. And what I tell people is if a person is not valuable enough to you as an organization for you to reply to them, which has a strong positive effect in keeping them engaged, getting them to potentially buy from you, like all these different things, that's okay. I'm not criticizing people, but then they shouldn't be on your list. You should literally unsubscribe folks that are not valuable enough for you to be able to make that contact point. For 99%, right? Maybe there's some outliers. You're a $4 a month, super horizontal product. 99% of B2B brands, you should reply to people. You should push for replies. And if they're not valuable enough, that is okay. But unsubscribe those people because they shouldn't be on your newsletter if that is not the case.
Okay. Perfect. And I think just the last question that I can't help but ask, and this is getting a little bit away from the email newsletter side, but you mentioned your own biases with basically those urgency emails. How do you kind of, I guess, get over those in a way? It's, because I'm sure there's a lot of having to talk yourself down because I know, myself, I have certain biases against certain things in content that I'm like, no, we're not doing it, but I also sit there and go, well, this could just be my personal bias against it. And it could really work. So, like, I guess, what's your approach for kind of getting your mindset straight on those points?
Yeah, I'm very data driven there. So not only am I looking at my own data, but I spend a lot of time talking with tons of people. So to give you guys an example, a little while back, I talked to, I think it was like 22 different people who ran newsletters over 25,000 subscribers. And I asked them, like, I wanted to know, what was your growth at month 1, at month 3, at month 6, at month 12? I wanted to know, how are you growing it? Where are you promoting it? And I just looked at all of those data points. What were their focuses? What were their KPIs? Like, what was helping them be successful? To our thing we were talking about earlier, how many of them were company? How many of them were name? How many of them were name at company? Like, I broke down and got into all of those things. And then you let that be the leading signal. If I'm like, I really don't like when I get a personal name, like it doesn't seem to work. And then I look and I'm like, well, actually, that seems to be the thing that's really successful. Then maybe I need to go back and I need to reevaluate. And so one of the things with urgency emails is I started just talking with a lot of brands. And I want to note here, especially brands with larger email lists. The larger the brand, the more pipeline they have to potentially push to the door. I come from the startup world for most of my career. I've worked at 150 or less employee organizations. I now work at ActiveCampaign, a 1,000-person company. So that's been a big learning that at a company that is much larger, like ActiveCampaign, there's way more direct revenue opportunities. ActiveCampaign drives millions and millions of dollars per year directly from email, right? In past startups, it wasn't like that. It's like, yeah, email's building some pipeline, it's getting some opportunities. Maybe it's a little ABM play, a reactivation play, but it's not like you're driving $8 million a year from email directly. But for larger brands with that pipeline, with those 50,000 trials that basically tried it this year, but within the last 6 months haven't converted, running urgency deals to that cohort is a really smart thing, and you should be doing it. And you're leaving money on the table if you're not doing it, right? But it's a little bit, in some ways, a proxy to size. Like, one other thing I'll say on that is, like, in some ways it has parallels to social media. I teach a lot on like LinkedIn and how to grow that channel. If you are a very large channel, Jason Lemkin's a perfect example. Jason Lemkin, if you follow his content, you will find that he does tons of plugs in his comments and even just his regular posts for SaaStr. He can do it. He has a large, high intent audience. If any of us hop on and we have 3,000 followers and we're just like posting about our product all the time, we will fail. And the reason is we don't have that. We don't have that captive audience that's ready to go. We need to focus on topical authority content. We need to focus on the content that's going to expand the profile and build the trust. So part of these decisions is understanding, what stage are you at? Do you already have that established footprint, or do you need to build it? Those are two different scenarios.
Okay, awesome. Well, Casey, we'll go ahead and wrap there, but that was fantastic. I'm sure everyone is going to come away with a ton of things they need to add to their to-do lists for their newsletters. So thank you so much. That really was awesome.
Yeah, hope it was helpful.
Yeah. All right, everyone. Well, we hope you have a great rest of your day and basically enjoyed the session. See you all soon. Bye-bye.